recommend the book Ted Bundy, Life and Death on the Row by R.V. Hawkins, Hawkins. Again, Debbie and I rode with him in 1967 outside of Jeb Stuart Junior High School. It's a long story. It's a very long story. It was only 12 minutes, but it's a long story because there were a few interruptions during the years at a bowling alley where she ran over where the men drink beer, which I thought was odd because they were supposed to be at the roller rink. The trip up to Riviera Apartments where the guy had a bicycle wheel attached to the ceiling with all the kitchen utensils in it. He wouldn't let me open the refrigerator door. Jeannie's pregnancy. I read this book because there are words that he said. The amount of sex that went on in that prison in the 70s is out, in 70s and 80s. This correctional officer, I believe, was a correctional officer for 10 to 15 years. He's quite the writer. His verbiage, his language is very strong. I can't find the words this morning. Bundy said himself that yes, because of his sexual, his SA, his sexual assaults, I guess that's allowed to say because they say SA, during the course of the years, he thinks that there may have been other children that were born of him. Then there's this talk about the guy that snatched his mother from the front seat to the back seat by her hair and basically raped her, and that's how he came about. He may have overheard that and misinterpreted it. Maybe the father was talking about Louise and what she shouldn't have done. But I'm sure from her personality that I see, she might have thought, oh, this is going to be a good relationship. I'm going to go with this guy. But then he just left her. But anyway, that's regardless. When the gun was pulled, the revolver, at West Gannett in Lamoille, in his right hand, oddly, and he held it to the ceiling of the car, and I said, what is your name? And he said, Theodore. And I said, Theodore? And in my little 12-year-old mind, there was no door. See a door? Okay, so anyway, then I said, well, what is your last name? And he said, Bundy. And I said, your name is Bundy like my clarinet, and your gun is silver like Debbie's flute. Debbie's father's an admiral at NASA because Miss Hogue always said, my husband's a CO and y'all are just E's. My husband's a CO. Well, the E was in Normandy, Mr. Davis, and my dad was an aircraft mechanic who learned jet engines in New York City and was on the Saratoga and possibly the Enterprise and a few others. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Poor Mrs. Hogue. She was manic depressive. She had a good heart, but a lot of times her disease was out of control, and that's one of the reasons we never talked about the encounter. I guess Debbie was scared. I don't know. But anyway, skip all that. There's two portions in the book that caught my eye. There's gratuitous sex. It's horrible. Apparently, Bundy was SA'd, and he also had some problems with the litigation in his 86 appeal, clemency appeal for stay of execution. And for some reason, he took a notion not to bathe. And he also had stomach issues, which I find odd. I wonder if he wasn't turning into AIDS, maybe something had happened to him and he had AIDS and he would have gone out by that anyway eventually. I don't know. They mentioned that he had bad body odor, but it was because of the circumstance. He wasn't bathing after the SA. He just, and he also had diarrhea, which was grotesque. But anyway, so moving on, the correctional officer said even when he was very hygienic, he liked to keep everything neat and clean and neat, and his cell was neat. He was very parsimonious about that. But occasionally, during some of his trials, he'd had this bad body odor. It just emanated from him. One of his defense investigators mentioned the bad body odor. Ann Rule, when she went to Utah, says she smelled acrid sweat, vomit, and tear. She said she hated it. She could smell the ammonia. Yeah, there is a smell when you go into a jail. I worked the jail during my 2.5 years. I would be the person that would wrap up the the incoming things. I guess it were dockets, I don't know. I would type them in because they wanted to make sure the jail wasn't overcrowded, so they had to have a count, and so we would enter the arrest things into the primitive computer, and I would go over from dispatch and walk across the street over to the jail, and I would enter the things. Anyway, there was an odor that emanated from him, and I've said before, it smelled like, if you've ever had to go up a homeless person, if you've ever smelled a homeless, it's a sweet, acrid, urine, fecal material smell. If you were in the 60s and a person had a pile of dirty clothes, one pile was for washing and one pile was for the laundry, that the ones that were dirty had a similar smell, a sweet, acrid smelling of sweat, fecal material, and urine. That's the way it smells. So they mentioned that in the book, and also I'm back to the 86 thing. Some nurse would visit him. They had sex with more than Carol Boone on the row during them visiting hours. It's grotesque. And then of course the men would have, they're called bitches, and they would have sex in the jail. It was horrible. It's a horror. There's a lot of that in there. But that reminds me of the gallows humor they'd have even in that booking office. A few hours I would be in the booking office, a lot of gallows humor. Anyway, you just, well, how do you know in law enforcement you did 37 years at IRS? Well, I went in to get my AA in 75. I worked for JSO from 75 till November of 77. And during that time, I did take advantage of getting the associates. I got my associate's degree, majoring in criminal justice, and my associate's in science, majoring in law enforcement criminal justice, and then my Bachelor of Arts, which took me to 84. So, and then I was in the Army Reserve from about 78 to 86. So from 76 to 86, I was surrounded by police officers. Some police officers taught the college courses, or former FBI agents taught the courses. Policemen were taking the courses because you got an upgrade if you had an associate's degree. You got even more if you had a bachelor's degree. So from 76 to 86, I was surrounded by the same people in the job that I'd already left. David Shores, Charlie Hill is who I tried to mention, the other one. I saw him running around sometimes. If things had just been a few months difference in my debacle, then I would have told the story when I began to realize we didn't ever hear from him again, and we never knew his name was Ted. Okay, and if there was some short little article about murders going on in the Northwest, I sure as hell did. The next time I ever realized anything to do with him, per se, was in 78, and I think there was a newspaper, Florida Times-Union, and it may have had that federal FBI most wanted poster, and they had like 7 or 8 pictures of him. I ran down to my godmother's house, Mrs. Davis, and I said, Mrs. Davis, this is the weirdo we rode with. There was a lot of contention about that stupid ride. It turned out my pretending to hitchhike didn't have anything to do with it. Debbie had prearranged to meet up with him at the bleachers. I think she had a sore foot or something. Okay, thank you.